If you remember from earlier, the non-breach risk equation is like the incremental risk equation, but the system response is no longer present in the equation. The non-breach risk is the risk associated with the dam or levee operating as intended or overtopping without breach, and is equal to the probability of the hazard times the non-breach consequences summed up over the full range of hazard. Here is the non-breach calculation using the project event tree. The non-breach scenario assumes 100% reliability and intended operation, so all failure mode system response probabilities are set to 0. Next, I will run through a quick example. I've already covered how to partition hazard curves into intervals when calculating the incremental risk, and we'll do it the same way for the non-breach risk. The partitions we develop should be the same across all types of risk that we calculate. For each hazard interval, we will interpolate from the non-breach life loss table to get the non-breach life loss for the midpoint of each hazard interval, and we will do that for each exposure scenario being considered. Once we've done that, we'll multiply the day exposure by the day non-breach life loss and add it to the product of the night exposure and the night non-breach life loss to get the weighted non-breach life loss. Multiplying the exposure-weighted non-breach life loss by the hazard probability and then summing across all intervals gives us 6.21 times 10 to the minus 3 lives per year for the non-breach risk. We can also calculate the non-breach average annual economic cost. This is done using the same steps as we did for the average annual life loss, but using dollars and cents instead of life loss. We typically present the non-breach risk on the big FN plot and the F$ plots, and cumulatively versus the hazard for average annual life loss and average annual economic cost. The non-breach risk big FN plot is constructed the same way as the incremental FN plot. But for the FN pairs, F is the hazard probability multiplied by the exposure, and N is the non-breach life loss. The gray dashed line shown does not have the same meaning as the societal tolerable risk limit on the big FN plot. It is used as a reference line to allow easy comparison between the non-breach risk and the incremental life safety risk. There are no life safety risk guidelines for the non-breach risk. I find it most illustrative to plot the incremental risk and the non-breach risk on the same plot, along with the residual risk, which I will cover next.